Well, wonderful. Let's go ahead and get started. We are very lucky today to have Dr. Michelle Edwards with us. She is a sociologist who teaches at Texas State University, but she actually received her PhD in sociology from WSU, just relatively up the road here. She teaches classes in environmental sociology, research methods, and advanced methodologies as well. Her research interests focus on issues of environmental risk perception, inequality, methods. I'm familiar with her work on issues around fracking. And then today we're going to be able to hear about some work on immigrant detention facilities. She's the recipient of multiple teaching awards and has also served some high profile roles in the American Sociological Association section on environmental sociology. So it's really a pleasure to have Dr. Edwards here with us to talk about some of her recent collaborative work. I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dr. Cordner and Dr. Laverso for having me here and for putting this all together. It's been really exciting kind of thinking about what I would say to Whitman College students and to be able to share a little bit about some of the research that I've done and kind of where it's headed, especially thinking about some of the changes that have been happening with NEPA as well as with COVID. So what I'm going to do right now is share my screen just for a minute. Okay, and then, all right. Can everybody see that? Yes? Okay, great. Actually, wait, let me make it big again. Okay. Okay, so my talk, a little bit about me, just like Dr. Cordner said. I originally am from Texas. I grew up in the Rio Grande Valley, and for most of my life have lived in this state. But I did for a little period live in Washington, in Pullman, and I have a soft spot in my heart for Washington State. And so I have a little bit in my slideshow kind of thinking about Washington State and looking up a couple of things that might be helpful for folks who are not in Texas. Okay, so this talk is entitled Environmental Injustices in Immigrant Detention, Absences in the National Environmental Policy Act Process. And like many other folks, I want to start with a land acknowledgement. And, in addition to kind of making the land acknowledgement, I will also come back to it and how it connects to the topic of my talk today. And so I want to recognize that where I'm living and working and playing and existing, which is Central Texas, I live in Austin, is the occupied territory of peoples, including the Alabama Cushada, the Caddo, the Carrizo Come Crudo, the Coahuiltecan, Comanche, Kickapoo, Lipan Apache, Tonkawa, and Isleta del Sur Pueblo. And I want to recognize the continued stewardship of Indigenous peoples in this region. And as a person who identifies as white and has European ancestry, I want to recognize that this statement doesn't absolve me and other settlers of our responsibility. And so I want to kind of think about, as we begin, in ways that's similar. I watched a previous talk from Dr. Pello, and I want to make kind of a similar connection that he was making between a number of different historical to present situations that we're facing. And so one of those connections is with settler colonialism. This is from an author, Saito, who states, indefinite detentions in the US have in large measure been connected to the settler colonists' appropriation of indigenous lands, their utilization of enslaved labor to develop and profit from those lands, and their desire to contain and control sectors of the population that they perceive as superfluous to the well-being of, quote, their state. And so these are kind of the big connections that I'm going to be trying to make in this talk, is thinking about settler colonialism, enslavement of people of color, Black people in particular, and then kind of from there to mass incarceration today, and then connecting also with immigrant detention. Okay, so my plan for our chat today is to go through and give you a little bit of background information. And some of this overlaps, like I said, with Dr. Pello's presentation. So, some of it, especially going over kind of racialized violence, some of that stuff, I can definitely give you more details if people are interested. But I'll spend probably the good chunk of the talk talking about the case study that my colleagues and I worked on, looking at NEPA and Texas immigrant detention centers, and then a little brief period kind of talking about changes to NEPA under the Trump administration, and then thinking about potential future action. Okay, so my general topic, kind of the overarching theme, is how our nation's oldest environmental law plays a role in perpetuating racialized violence. And for me, kind of thinking about this law, a lot of times the criticisms that you find of NEPA, of the policy that I'll be talking about, come from folks who are either industrial affiliated or otherwise kind of pursuing growth. And so they're having complaints about NEPA from that perspective, wanting to have a lack of regulation for having to think about environmental and social impacts. Now, my colleagues and I, we're critiquing NEPA, but from a very different place, a place that's looking at how the state, through its normal practices, continue to perpetuate environmental injustices. And so this is kind of the maybe perspective you can think about in terms of what I'm taking. Okay. So the National Environmental Policy Act is sometimes called the Magna Carta of our environmental policies. It's the first, it's the kind of basic one for protecting the environment. And what it calls for is for federal government agencies to think about social and environmental concerns and actually kind of gather information about these issues before making decisions. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that they have to make the best decisions, best social, best environmental decisions. It doesn't necessarily mean that, right? It just means that they have to bring that information in. In some ways, it also encourages the inclusion of the public and kind of involving the public in the process, again, as this idea of like having more information. So it's really a knowledge production process. It's overwhelming when you look at it. Okay, so I'm gonna walk y'all through the NEPA process, just kind of hit the highlights. And then again, and I do so only because again, when part of what makes this so complicated, right, is that there's so many acronyms, such a big learning curve for folks to be able to really understand NEPA that oftentimes it's only experts and folks who are actively engaged in the process who really kind of understand what's going on and who can contribute and participate. And so I don't want that to be the case. I want people to understand. And I also want you to understand, so what our research is focused on are the ways in which there's some missing information. Okay, so you start at the very top. And if I'm going too fast, somebody just let me know. But so you start at the very top, say you're a federal agency, you start at the very top and you have some sort of an action that you want to take. Your first step is to decide if environmental effects are likely to be significant. And for us, that was already the first stage where we're like, wait, isn't the whole process supposed to be about figuring out what those potential environmental impacts are? And so this is really like your first black box, if you think about it, right? So the first black box is what is going on when you're starting to try to figure out as an agency if these environmental effects are likely to be significant. What typically seems to happen is that an agency will go through, and if you go kind of, at least on my screen to the left, that left number 3, the first thing that you do is you look to see in the list of all the categorical exclusions, like basically the reasons why you wouldn't have to go through the NEPA process. You see if you can find something that's relevant to whatever the action is that you might be interested in taking. Now, if you can take one of those categorical exclusions, and if you look on the right-hand side, I've put from the general account, oh, I knew I was going to mess this one up, the GAO, the Government Accountability Office. There you go. So if you look at their estimation, they estimate about 95% of actions fall under this categorical exclusion category. So you can see that's like a huge proportion. If it goes through there and they decide that it doesn't have any kind of extraordinary circumstances, then you're done, right? Then the agency can go on with their action. If they're not certain, so say you're starting off and you find that there's no categorical exclusion that you can, fit your project under, then they have to go over to that middle part of the flow chart. And so with this one, if the environmental impacts are uncertain, or they're not really sure what those might look like, then they might actually undergo what is called creating an environmental assessment. And so this is not as the third column, which you'll see on the right hand side, is kind of the most comprehensive, the most in-depth, the most amount of public involvement, kind of that stuff. The EAs in the middle are kind of a start, but they're usually a little bit smaller. If they decide after the end of doing that environmental assessment that there are no significant environmental impacts, then they'll produce what's called a FONSI document, or a finding of no significant impact, and then again, they'll move forward. If they find that there are significant environmental impacts, or from the get-go, they've kind of identified that there are some significant environmental impacts, then they move to that third column. And this is the one that takes the longest. It's the preparation of the environmental impact statement. And it's the one that typically involves the most, at least has the most requirements for having public comment. And so you'll notice that a couple of times in there. But again, as the GAO report documents, it's less than 1% of the actions that the federal government actions that people might be taking. Okay. Another thing of note is that so again, the process is kind of laid out fairly clearly, that people have to take. And one part of that, signed by President Clinton in an executive order, was that environmental justice concerns have to be included in those NEPA environmental assessments. Okay, and so what we'll do today is in part kind of talk about what that looks like. Okay, so and again, we'll come back to Clinton. So the other part of our chat, right, the other part of my of our research topic is thinking about how this process, how the NEPA process works for different federal agencies. And so we were we're looking at the environmental policy, the National Environmental Policy Act, and then putting it over here under the lens of like what's going on in the Department of Homeland Security. And so to understand that, we have to kind of understand what's going on with immigration, particularly criminalization as it relates to immigration. And so just as a little bit of background, I think today a lot of times people think about detention and imprisonment as just, kind of this like, oh, well, that's just the way we've always done things, but it really isn't. And it didn't really become, with a few exceptions, it didn't really become the primary strategy until really the 1970s and 1980s. And it was especially under President Clinton, who greatly militarized the US-Mexico border, like where I grew up, and signed this Illegal Immigration Reform and Immigrant Responsibility Act that really greatly expanded detention and deportation. And this is one of those things that, again, whether the president was Republican or Democrat, each administration following Clinton has worked to expand this system, coming up with new things that people can potentially get deported for and detained for, excuse me. They've kind of flip-flopped a little bit in terms of which one they've emphasized. So for example, under Obama, which some people call deporter in chief, more people were deported than detained, although they did build the first family detention facilities. Under President Trump, in contrast, more people were detained than deported. And many of you probably witnessed in news articles the, in my view, horrific policies of separating families at the border. So something that's really important to note, and again, these are where you're going to see connections between mass incarceration and the criminal justice system and immigration and detention systems there, is that this is all happening under a racialized lens, right? So Latino and Black immigrants are disproportionately represented in detention facilities as well as in apprehensions and deportations. And many people point to racial profiling as one of the reasons for this. One of the other things is that these enforcement strategies have pushed detention into increasingly remote sites. So similar to prisons, again, they're starting to build these in places that are far from people's families, attorneys, other folks that could potentially help to advocate on behalf of them. So just like Dr. Pello talked about, and this is something that I think is a little bit maybe different than some of the things that environmental sociologists might have been looking at before, environmental injustice, like we think about this as forms of violence that are sustained by the state, right? So the state, in other words, government, plays a key role in these systems, in perpetuating these forms of racialized violence. They're the norm, not the exception. And I think for a lot of scholars and for a lot of activists, for a long period of time, the state was seen as, the government was seen as the potential pathway through which you could work for liberation. And now you see more and more pushback against that, saying that, the state is actually actively engaged in this racialized violence. So kind of shifting gears a little bit and thinking about, again, some of the research on environmental justice and injustices really related to incarceration. There's a growing amount of research, and Dr. Pello is one of the key persons in that, looking at how prisons and jails produce environmental harms, and that part of the rationale for this is that people of color in this country are often seen as expendable, or what you'll see in my study, invisible. Okay, so looking at some of the very limited, there's sadly not very much research on environmental inequalities in immigrant detention. Some of the studies that I found have talked about some similar issues that you would find in looking at other forms of imprisonment. So proximity to toxic land, air pollution and water contamination issues, food issues, both quality and quantity, right? Not having enough and what it is, lack of sanitation, overcrowding. And then one of the key ones, actually, these are all key, but the physical and emotional trauma that's not only experienced by the people who are incarcerated, but by their families and children who kind of bear those anxieties through the entire process. And then substandard medical care. Some of you might have heard not too long ago about hysterectomies and other kinds of procedures happening against people who are detained against their without their consent. Anyway, so there's lots of issues that have emerged that that scholars are starting to look into. Okay, to add to that, right, with the current context, so we did our study before COVID. Was there ever a time? Yeah, so we did our study before COVID, and we're starting to kind of bring light to the idea that immigrant detention centers are again an overlooked place where people are not really thinking about them as having these environmental problems and being toxic for the people who are living in them. And then COVID hit, and And then you're starting to see, again, I didn't want to be like, yeah, we were saying that, but, people started talking about these as places, very dangerous places for the people who are living in them. And so if we think about the current context, some of the things that have changed that matter if we're talking about environmental justice is that the length of detention has increased, which ICE attributes to COVID. So things like borders closing, which potentially affect deportation, delayed court proceedings. So you can see here, right? So there's about 33% of people in 2015 who were detained, for over a month. All those numbers. So again, that's just kind of looking at length of time then. Now you can see, boom, big jump ups for immigrant detention kind of in the post-COVID period. There's also significant health problems due to COVID, due to outbreaks of COVID. And again, I want to emphasize that these are things that are not, again, they were things that people could have foreseen, as well as things that the guidelines create, right? So the guidelines create additional problems. The norms, the expectations create these additional problems. So for example, under ICE policy, right? So these are the policies. This isn't like an oopsie. Under the ICE policy, people with respiratory symptoms are grouped together in a single room, even though they don't know their COVID test results yet. So you could have allergies, you could have something else entirely, and you're all grouped together without actually testing to see who has COVID. And so again, you're seeing this increased spread. When new people come in, new detainees come in, which they have not stopped bringing people into detention, and they know that the person who they're bringing in has been exposed to COVID, they merely monitor them. That's their policy, instead of actually quarantining. So there's things, again, that people have been critical of because the policies differ from CDC guidelines. So, and again, this isn't just like wild, like radical leftist propaganda. This is from Scientific American. And it's not just in Texas, right? So here's from Texas. It's also happening in Washington. And so these are issues, again, that are happening nationally. Okay, so getting into our study, and I really want to start off by thanking my co-authors, Brianna Luna and Hannah Edwards. Brianna was a former undergrad student. I had her in an intro sociology class, my first year teaching at Texas State, and we just really connected. And Hannah is a former graduate student of mine, who, again, we just really had a fantastic research collaborative relationship. And so they worked together with me on this project, kind of beginning stages all the way up into publication. So if I don't cover everything right now, which I won't be able to, feel free to email me and I'd be happy to send you our paper. Okay, so our main questions are what, and more specifically, who is left out of the regular NEPA knowledge production process? And again, how does this perpetuate environmental and social inequalities? We focused on Texas, and partly, no, not really, but sometimes as Texans, we kind of think that the world begins and ends in Texas. But also Texas really, in an unfortunate way, leads the nation in detention. And so it's a place where, again, where it's important that we think about what's going on here. The way that we did our analysis, which is a little bit different, we were looking at it from a qualitative perspective. So again, we're not counting up things. We're trying to understand qualitatively what's there and really more what's not there. And this is kind of a hard way to study stuff. So you're looking at documents, and for NEPA, the documents are everything, right? The documents are the bread and butter of NEPA. And so we're looking through documents, trying to figure out, what's missing, which groups are missing, where are people not, not included in this process in ways that can create environmental risks for some folks more than others. And so these are the documents that we looked at. One of the things I want you to kind of notice is that they have to do with a couple of different projects. So the first one, this is the list of categorical exclusions. So this is for the Department of Homeland Security. These are kind of their items that they can potentially have actions fall under. So that's something that, again, is used over time, even though it's from 2006. Some of these others are for different specific detention centers. So the bottom three are for different specific detention facilities and the various documents that went with them. And then the top one is a programmatic assessment, which I'll talk about what that means in a little bit. So basically we went through all these documents, line by line, kind of trying to understand what was there and what wasn't there. I fit this idea in under the sociology concept of undone science, which is where you're looking at research that, again, it's leaving stuff incomplete, but that has been recognized by social movements, in our case, community organizers who are fighting for immigrant rights issues, that's been identified as worthy questions for people to pursue. So part of this is really inspired by the work that some journalists and community organizers and civil rights lawyers have brought to our attention. Okay, so we'll go through different examples. I'll go through different examples of absences. And again, these are just examples. The paper goes through more detail for each of them. Okay, so the first one that we identified was an absence of process. And what this means is that really there was a lack of, it was kind of that black box idea I was talking about at the beginning, that there's a lack of transparency of the process they actually go through, that the DHS actually goes through in deciding when to use categorical exclusions to replace actually going through the NEPA process and evaluating environmental and social risks. And so this is just one example. So this is a categorical exclusion that, that the agency could potentially use. So it says that new construction upon or improvement of land where the following conditions are met. And so one of the key conditions I want us to think about is that the site is in a developed area and or previously disturbed site. So in other words, you can potentially say, like, look, we don't need to do any kind of environmental assessment because this is already a disturbed site. And therefore, we don't need to worry about it as a potential having potential environmental risks. And so people said that so they actually had comments. They allowed people to comment on these categorical exclusions, and we could see that document. And one of the things that people identified was that this could be a potential loophole permitting just an infinite amount of construction in a place. And I'll bring an example in at the end, looking at Washington, how you could, again, be excused from doing environmental evaluations by basically saying this place is already toxic, so don't bother. Okay, the other part of the process that we felt, again, created this potential for environmental risk was that they had two different kinds of environmental assessments and environmental impact statements. They had programmatic ones, which are broader and are like talking about like immigrant detention strategies in general, not like for a specific place or project or like this detention center. And then there were the site specific ones, which were focused on a particular detention center. And this is from, again, a news article. And they talked to a NICE spokesperson, and they said that the agency didn't have a project level environmental assessment for this particular family jail, the Carnes family jail, most likely because it had been tied to the programmatic environmental assessment. And so in other words, for some of the site specific projects, they just basically said, well, we kind of evaluated immigrant detention on a larger scale. And so we decided at that point that it's not environmentally risky. And so we'll apply that down to this particular site. In some of the other sites, they decided that they needed individual project level assessments. But again, it wasn't clear why or when they decided to kind of either just rely on the big one or have to make a smaller one. Okay, this one to me, this second absence is probably one of the most shocking for folks who haven't been looking at this. There's near complete exclusion of the people who are detained themselves as an affected social group. So even though, again, the whole point of this is supposed to be identifying environmental and social risks, it is not required for people who are producing these NEPA and NEPA documents. It is not required that they actually include consideration of environmental and social risks for the people who are living there, who are forced to live there. And this is actually, again, paralleled with other forms of incarceration. So the same thing is true when the Bureau of Justice goes through and has to decide to create a new prison somewhere. They also don't have to include the people who are living within those facilities as a potentially affected group. Okay. And even when they were looking at detaining children, right, they ultimately decided, and that was the one case in which they did talk about children under the environmental justice part. They ultimately said at the bottom here that the children would be better served, that this was actually the proposal of housing children in a detention center would actually be better for their health and safety than other alternatives, which would require for them to house them in crowded and unsanitary conditions. Okay, which brings me to our third idea, which is the absence of alternatives. And in this, one of the things that's required of the NEPA process is that you have to propose some alternatives to the action that the government agency might be proposing. So, you know, you might have your kind of preferred action, and then you have to say like, okay, well, so one option is going to be, I'm going to put this thing in Walla Walla. And then the other option is I'm going to put it in Pullman. And then the third option is I'm not going to put it anywhere. And so this is a required part of the NEPA process. But one of the things that some civil rights lawyers have drawn attention to is that oftentimes what they would do is they would, you know, propose some options at the beginning and then say, well, two of these, right? So say you're saying like, well, you know, Walla Walla is one option, Pullman's another option, but it's definitely not going to work. So before they'd even do the environmental part, they would just completely X off as an option one of the alternatives that they had identified. And this happened fairly commonly. Another thing is that they oftentimes had a very narrow scope of how they would define an alternative. And so, you know, for example, there would not be an actual alternative to detention, right? It would all be like, well, we're going to do detention in this city versus detention in this other city. Lastly, there was an absence of discourse, right? So even though the intention of this, maybe in theory, is supposed to be to include the public, what that actually looked like, again, standard practice is to put the documents, these, you know, environmental assessments or the environmental impact statement, to put it in the library for 30 days and see if anybody put a comment. And what they would find, like document after document, we'd read through and be like, well, there was no public comment. And you think, well, why would there be no public comment? And in part, you're thinking, okay, well, you know, again, where are they located? Do people know about them? Do people have the expertise to read them and understand what they're talking about? And so this is, again, this is an absence that's built into the system. Okay, so to just sum up with this particular project, it's thinking about, again, how people who are detained and their advocates are systematically excluded. Ibarra, who's a scholar from Washington State, she said, you know, that attending to the needs of the more than human species does not necessarily provide protections to people who are racialized as less than human. And you would see this in the document because there'd be pages devoted to endangered birds and other kinds of, you know, like fish in the area, and then nothing, zero on the people who are detained in these facilities. So it does create knowledge, but in this very limited scope. Okay, I know I have, you know, just a little bit more time to kind of give you some background. So I'm going to do a little bit of very brief stuff, kind of post-study, and then I look forward to hearing questions. Okay, so what's been happening since then? All right, it seems like kind of like with thinking about immigrant detention, where each administration seems to try to one-up each other with creating more detention policies and more ways to detain people and deport people. The same thing is true for NEPA. You know, administration after administration, there have been calls to, quote, streamline it, modernize it, cut it down, from George W. Bush, Obama, Trump, and this most recent one has been actually followed up with them doing some of this modernization. And I'll explain what modernization, it sounds nice, but I'll explain what it actually means. And so this started in July of 2020 is when they actually put the rule in place. And what it does, right, so these are some of the changes. What it does is gives year limits for how long it can take to produce these documents, to produce the environmental assessments and the environmental impact statements, and page limits on the documents, right? So it's trying to cut it down in size, not be so long, not be so in depth. It's allowing contractors, so the folks who are wanting to, do whatever action, it's allowing them to actually prepare their own environmental impact statements, which obviously represents a conflict of interest. And it allows agencies to use other agencies' categorical exclusions, right? So further expanding kind of the idea that you don't have to actually go through this process. Some of to me, the key parts that I really want people to understand is that it also prohibits agencies from considering effects that they perceive as, or that they call not reasonably foreseeable, or not having a reasonably close causal relationship. So this is anything that has, in their view, scientific uncertainty, or that relates to some sort of cumulative impact or indirect impact. And this was a very clear, what people have talked about is this is a very clear effort to remove discussion of climate change as one of the environmental impacts, right? So that's cut out. The other thing, and this gets to our discussion of alternatives previously, is that they now have to be economically feasible, right? So these are not just any alternatives that you can propose. They have to be ones that they basically already fit this narrow criteria. So the idea being, in this picture visualized what they said that they were doing, is cutting the red tape and decreasing the size of the paperwork that now today is so big. But what other scholars have talked about with the concept of neoliberal bureaucracy is that cutting the red tape is actually increasing and using state power to force people to conform to principles, economic principles related to competition in the market, and basically using increasing state power to actually create more harms for the environment and for people. And so for me, kind of the interesting next steps where we're going with this project is thinking about the goal, right? The goal that they had in mind, which is trying to eliminate uncertainty, right? And it reminded me of, I don't know if y'all read, George Ritzer did a piece called something about McDonald'sization. And it's this idea, that again, that the rationalization process is supposed to create predictability and calculability. It's all about like how much and trying to have this control. And it reminded me of an article, of an online article that I had read that said that, this ways of mitigating uncertainty, which uncertainty will always exist, right? That's just an inherent part of environmental risk, is that there is uncertainty. But this idea of mitigating uncertainty leads settler culture in its past and present manifestations to believe in the possibility of wielding control over people and land. And so again, kind of bringing back to the logic of settler colonialism and this idea, this false idea that that you can actually, completely control something. Okay, so future action. This is bringing us back to Washington State. And I know Dr. Pello in his talk talked about very briefly the Northwest Detention Center. There's been I just read an incredible article by Dr. Ibarra, who's a geography professor at the University of Washington, who works with La Resistancia, which is an abolitionist collective. And one of the things that is emphasized in that article is that it doesn't differentiate, as many have, between, quote, worthy and unworthy immigrants in thinking about, again, exposure to environmental toxins. And I'm just going to kind of briefly talk about these excerpts from the paper to again highlight this idea that this is just kind of embedded as normal process. So Dr. Ibarra visited the Environmental Justice Office, and they were teaching her about or showing her about the mapping tools that communities can use. And so they were kind of practicing with it. And they asked her what site that she wanted to map. And she said the Northwest Detention Center. And so they started to look at it, and they were kind of mapping onto it the Superfund site, the toxic storage facilities, and the people that she was working with had not recognized that that detention would be undercounted in this tool. Even though, again, so they didn't know about this as an environmental justice issue, even though it's, not more than 40 miles from their office. And so they loaded the map, and what they found was that there were less than 40 residents living there. And that was a surprise to them, because there were 1,575 beds, an array of visitors, round the clock employees. So again, there's not less than 40 residents. The other people just don't count. And it basically said on the screen that there were no measured site contaminants that would pose environmental health risks. So again, she was kind of like, well, that's weird, because, well, that's my interpretation. I'm doing basically how I was imagining she was acting. But they were thinking like, well, that's weird, because this is a Superfund site. And again, it's not because it was clean. This is what the article stated, but because the private company that owns the land refuses to allow them to actually take soil, water, and air samples. So again, this perception that it's clean, that it's fine, that there's nothing wrong, is built on the lack of information, the lack of knowledge. And so again, when you look this site up, it says no properties found, no people live there, even though, again, you can even see it on the Google map. And this site in particular, from the environmental impact statement, it was picked because it was significantly disturbed by past development, right? In other words, that was one of its selling points, was that nobody was going to want this. Right? They didn't have to have an impact on any other of the quote good lands, right? They can just put it here in this disturbed land. And so these are some resources for other folks that I saw who are doing work on this topic in Washington, as well as resource at the bottom for students who are undocumented at Whitman. And then these are some faculty members that I saw. Again, it's not a comprehensive list, but just some ideas for folks. And then just last to finish, to recognize solidarity across movements, right? The abolish detention, the linkages between the abolish detention movement, the abolish prisons movement, and the fights against settler colonialism. All right, thank you all so much for this opportunity. I think I went long, but hopefully we're good. Can I stop the share? Is that okay? Or
that's just fine. Yes, thank you so much, Dr. Edwards. That was wonderful. And I am sure that folks who are in the webinar format will have questions. You can type them into the chat, and I will offer them to Dr. Edwards as they appear. I'll take the liberty of a first question. I really love how you analyze explicitly for absence and the absence of attention to issues. And in terms of our students, I'm wondering if you have any methodological advice for them. I know that a couple of my thesis students right now are working on projects around representations of justice and inclusion or exclusion, a couple of them on sort of looking at corporate actors. I'm wondering how they could be attuned to absence and how absence is connected to power and inequality in their own work.
That's a wonderful question. Thank you so much. Yeah, so I think in part, right, what kind of got me started on this project, I did my master's thesis looking, doing interviews. I've done both qualitative and quantitative work, but I did my master's thesis doing interviews with community organizers for farm workers. And I had a really positive experience doing it, but I also recognized the ways in which historically white people like myself have gone to communities of color, communities of lower income individuals, and focused our attention there to look at environmental injustices. And that can be problematic, right? That there can be, and again, I didn't come at that project with an intention of exploitation, but I also know that there are ways in which, you know, that's not the only way to study environmental injustice, is to look at groups who have been historically wronged within these systems. And so I wanted to kind of think about, I was inspired by Dr. Pello, and I wanted to think about how can we look at folks like, you know, my dad's a professor, a retired professor, but, you know, like he's a biologist. I wanted to look at folks who were in the environmental realm, but kind of coming at it from a really different perspective. And so I started to kind of get interested in the NEPA process, and we were kind of looking through the documents, and I was inspired by Dr. Frickel, actually, who I worked with previously, to kind of think about more than just what's there. And I know it's weird. Again, it's like, it's not what we usually, not at least what I usually teach in my methods classes. But I think that that's kind of the exciting part for, you know, for students who are, you know, kind of starting this process, is that there's so much out there, so much information out there that you can look at from very different perspectives. And so that's something that I think is just kind of interesting, that you don't have to think about doing everything. You can kind of take a piece, and I think I would emphasize even more the importance of, again, looking at things like the state and other groups that are engaged in perpetuating environmental injustices, but who have not historically been considered. Dr. Harrison's work is another really good example, you know, again, of looking behind the curtain at the folks creating these environmental policies. Okay, let me see. Can you comment on how changes in recent Supreme Court decisions regarding FOIA can further obfuscate social and environmental impact justice issues? Oh, bummer. See, I'm not sure I am not up to par on what the recent Supreme Court decisions. Can the person elaborate? Is that a possibility? Can they inform me? Hello, person out there. Oh, I can try. Okay, good.
You know, while they are writing a response, why don't we jump to another question, and then we can come back to the FOIA issue. So here's a question from Ethan. Given how complicated and arguably deliberately vague government guidelines for environmental protection can be, how might activists and even the common person understand what obligations government agencies have? And then how can we hold government agencies accountable?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And so it's interesting, like I said in the presentation, you know, I kind of want to distance our critiques of NEPA from the criticisms of people who are wanting to basically eliminate it so that they can kind of jump to the development process. And some of the things that they've done to streamline is to kind of reduce in length the NEPA documents, which actually I think is kind of a good idea. Like that part of it, the idea of making it a little bit, if that was the intention, which I don't think it was, but you know, the idea of actually making these documents more approachable to people, I think could be a really useful step. And so I think, for, like the question is saying, I think for a lot of folks, the NEPA process, the documents that are created are just really not intended for public consumption. They're not intended for people to really go through, sift through, try to understand what's going on. And even when they do, right, even when, you know, you'll have some high profile, like for example, the changes to NEPA itself, like those things, which were really complicated. I mean, I have a PhD and like it's super complicated to read through and try to understand what all was going on. You'll see thousands and thousands of public comments, people writing in, and a fairly minimal document afterwards from the agency, in this case, from the CEQ folks, kind of addressing concerns, really just like, you know, well, that's not really, you know, what we're talking about, and then just moving on, like really very minimal kind of inclusion when the public does have comments. And so I don't know, and again, I might be coming at, this is more me speaking as a person, I think. I don't know that I would necessarily recommend to my friends and neighbors that their best strategy is to go through trying to make a public comment to NEPA, I mean, to whatever the agency is, and, pursuing it that way. I don't, and that's where I think in the beginning, saying that the state is oftentimes, and this I think is really more rooted in kind of the mainstream environmental movement and the idea of litigation and like going through the law to try to make change. I really personally see more of like a collective environmental justice abolitionist type approach, where you're not trying to necessarily say that the system is going to work for you and that you can work within this system, but that you need to really work towards dismantling that system. And I don't just mean dismantling NEPA, I mean really more dismantling immigrant detention. I don't know if that answered the question.
No, that's great. I think it speaks to this broader systemic issue that NEPA is a reflection of underlying failed systems and inequitable systems. We have a clarification about the FOIA issue, and it looks from the description, so anything that speaks to preliminary thinking and deliberations are exempt from FOIA. FOIA is the Freedom of Information Act, which is an act that provided for the public to be able to request information and documentation from the government. And so only the final decision is released, not the questions or process by which they came to that decision. It seems to me that this speaks to these issues of procedural justice and access to information, this sort of invisibility of knowledge. Maybe that's a connection that you could make there.
Yeah, most definitely. Yeah. So again, I'm going to look this up afterwards to try to better understand how it connects to the project. And I know that for the documents that we looked at, I mean, one of those was based on a FOIA request that a series of organizations had put out when they were trying to create a detention facility on an Air Force base. And so what they were doing with the FOIA request was trying to see what information that they could find from, again, from the past for this Air Force site that could tell them a little bit more about the potential environmental toxins that people might be facing. I think it was children that might be facing there. And so I personally see FOIA as having a really important role in not just researchers being able to understand better what environmental risks people are facing in various spaces, but also, people in the public being able to understand what their neighbors and community and friends are facing. And so I think anything that, just like you're talking, the person's talking about here, anything that basically eliminates your ability to understand what was going on prior to that final decision, I think is an attempt again to keep people out. And so that's something that I think is very problematic. And especially as researchers who are looking at what's not there, I mean, this is like a key example of that, right? What's not there and why is it not there? I think are important questions that we have to have in mind.
Absolutely. And it decreases the responsiveness of the government if they don't have to disclose the process. It seems very problematic. We have another question from an attendee regarding holding agencies accountable. What is a tangible action that we can do today or right now? Who do we contact? What do we say other than just spreading information and providing education?
Yeah, so one of the things that I put in the slideshow, and I'm happy to share that slideshow or any of the things on it. I'll pull up the site. So one of the groups here, sorry, let me pull it up. One of the groups that they referenced, if I send this to, I don't know how to send this to everybody, but I'm going to send this to somebody and put that out there.
I think if you put it in the chat box, everybody should receive it. I think. If not,
put all panelists and attendees here. I'll do that.
Great.
There we go. Okay. So one of the groups that they had talked about in Washington specifically, right? So this is looking specifically at the state of Washington, was La Resistancia. And one of the things that I particularly found appealing about this organization, and I don't know, it's not like I work with them, so I don't know if they're, what they're doing right now during COVID or whatever, but I appreciated that they were working in collaboration with people who are currently detained. And so that to me is something that I think is really meaningful, that as you're working for trying to improve the rights of people who are incarcerated or detained, that it's in collaboration with the people that you are interested in helping. And this is something that, again, will help your response to be more informed and also kind of targeted at what people might need. And so that's an organization that the person in the other article had talked specifically about in the state of Washington that might be useful. I personally, I think in my own life, I think working on the local level produces a lot more. I found in Austin, like, I just feel like we make a lot more progress happening locally than when I've tried to do things in the past that are on a very national scale. But again, that could just be my personal experiences. But I feel like making connections with people can really kind of help to make transformations on that smaller scale.
That's great. And here in Wawa, we have the Wawa Immigrant Rights Coalition, which has done a lot of really broad work, including work on detention facilities.
Yeah, I think one of the key things to keep in mind for folks is that a lot of, again, this isn't just like a Republican thing. Republicans and Democrats alike have a lot of times framed the arguments around immigrant rights as, well, for the good immigrants, or for the immigrants who have like economic value, or who have families, or who have, somehow coming from like the good countries. For those, we want to treat them nice, but for everybody else, like kind of tough. And that's something that, again, I think is really important, that it's not posed as the worthy versus the unworthy. And then it's also not posed even, I used to say when I would teach this to my undergrad classes, I would talk about how, there's all these perceptions about how people who are immigrants are causing crime. And then when you actually look at it, crime rates are lower. So I talk through this thing. But even that, right, kind of poses the people who are incarcerated against the people who are immigrants in a very problematic way, because they're both impacted by racially unjust systems, right, that put people of color behind bars in similar ways that it puts particularly brown and black detainees behind bars. And so I think as much as we can kind of connect those movements, I think that's also kind of a useful thing for us to do, especially, like I think of that for myself as a white person who has a lot of privilege in being able to kind of have the good choices to make.
Wonderful. I feel like that's a perfect note to end on, this larger call for awareness of privilege and awareness of structural inequality, and very much connected to this broader theme of race, violence, and health that we're grappling with this semester. So please, all the participants, join me in thanking Dr. Edwards for her presentation today. And this talk will be available as a recording if you want to go back and look at it again. But yeah, thank you all very much. And I really appreciate Dr. Edwards being with us today.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate it. And I hope someday to get back to Washington and maybe even come visit y'all, and definitely see you, Alyssa.
We would love to host you in person as well.
Thank you all so much. I really appreciate it. Thank you to everybody who is here. Oh, good. I get to see people's names and stuff a little bit. All right. Thank you all so much. Yeah, feel free to reach out. I'm on email, sadly too much probably. Yeah, so I'm on email a lot. You can reach out to me anytime. I'm happy to do a Zoom visit with individuals. If anyone has, ideas, questions, etc. Thank you guys.
Excellent. Great.
All right, thanks.